SA Football Association President Danny Jordaan has appeared in court recently on fraud and theft charges. I was saddened by this because we go way back and I'm rather fond of him. Here's why. And here are some of the behind-the-scenes stories that led to me nicknaming him the Lugubrious Walrus. Welcome to the Luke Alfred Show. I have 30 years of experience on the front lines of sports journalism, covering some of the biggest games in cricket, rugby, the FIFA World Cup, and even the Olympic Games. Come and join me as we learn about some of the greatest sports stories you've never heard. I'm Luke Alfred, and welcome to the show. One hot afternoon in January 1996, I walked around the perimeter of Soccer City outside of Johannesburg with Danny Jordaan. We were joined by the sports journalist Ian Hawkey, later to become a close friend of mine, and the talk was amiable. Jordaan was a prodigiously amiable man. He still is an amiable man. He is so amiable that if there is a state of amiability beyond amiability, a sort of supercharged or V8 amiability, Jordaan is your guy. This is why, when working at the Sunday Times in Johannesburg, my colleagues and I always used to refer to Jordaan not as Captain Amiable, but as, wait for it, the Lugubrious Walrus. In early 1996, Jordaan had reason to be proud. Kenya could not discharge her hosting responsibilities to the 1996 Africa Cup of Nations, so South Africa stepped into the breach, a stroke of fabulous luck. It was a stroke of fabulous luck because, as hosts, South Africa qualified automatically for the competition using, get this, rugby grounds, like those in Bloem and Port Elizabeth, as venues for the soon-to-be hosted football. Jordaan was always careful what he said during those years, a trend that has continued up until the present, but one of the few noteworthy statements he used to make at the time was that football in South Africa needed its own dedicated grounds and stadiums. Only when it had them could it be liberated from its historical and circumstantial association with rugby and, therefore, apartheid. It was a sound argument. South Africa had played 3 matches in her qualifying group when news of her status as new Cup of Nations hosts emerged. The 3 matches included 1-0 wins over Madagascar and Mauritius and an away draw versus Zambia, otherwise known as the Sovereign Principality of King Kalusha Bwalya. Although handily placed, it was by no means a given that Bafana Bafana, as they were coming to be called in those days, would qualify. Both Zambia and Gabon were ahead of them in qualifying when the news came through that Kenya were unable to put on the show. So Jordaan had pretty good reason to be pleased that hot afternoon at the beginning of 1996. He would have had even more reason to do so as the tournament progressed. South Africa beat Cameroon, one of the powerhouses of the African game at the time, 3-0 in her opening match, which filled Bafana and the nation with a hope veering dangerously close to hysteria. The knockouts duly arrived. A narrow win over Algeria in a Saturday afternoon cloudburst couldn't dampen South African expectations, and when Ghana were thumped 3-0 in the semi-final, it seemed as though we were being given permission to think the unthinkable. South Africa's passage at this stage of the tournament was helped by Nigeria's absence. Nelson Mandela had criticized the execution of Ken Saro-Wiwa, the Nigerian environmental activist, by the Sani Abacha regime. In a fit of pique, Abacha had withdrawn Nigeria, the then holders, from the competition. Bafana would have needed to have played Nigeria to take the title away from them. In another stroke of rather fabulous luck, such a matchup didn't come to pass. Instead, Bafana Bafana played Tunisia in the final. In the second half, Dr. Khumalo played a diagonal ball crisp as a chicken wing to put through substitute striker Mark Williams, who made it 2-0 to the hosts. The cup was going on a journey. It was venturing into uncharted waters, as far south, in fact, as the continent stretched. These were heady days for South Africa, South African football, and the lugubrious Jordan. The rand was still strong in those days, or comparatively so, and locals were overly fond of talking about a quaint notion called the Rainbow Nation. Germany, England, France, the Netherlands, and Brazil, a personal Jordan favorite, ventured to these shores, or us to theirs, to play football friendlies. It was probably a close-run thing as to who had the bigger pulling power in those days, Nelson Mandela or Bebeto, Dunga, and Romario. Either way, Brazil were persuaded to arrive for the 1996 Nelson Mandela Challenge in April 1996. David Elleray, one of the most well-respected referees in the world, took the whistle, and the match started 20 minutes late because Vice President Thabo Mbeki couldn't get to Soccer City on time. South Africa scored first with a Phil Masinga header. They were in it until suddenly they weren't, running out losers 3-2. 18 months later, Bafana again lost to Brazil in a friendly by the odd goal. Nothing to be embarrassed about there. Brazil beat many a side by the odd goal in the late 1990s. Jordan was in charge of an association that took themselves seriously because they presided over a national side who took themselves seriously. These were not perfect times. South Africa's disappointing showing in the 1998 World Cup in France showed that. But they were times in which South African football was, if not a powerhouse, then at least committed to not being left behind. It was such status that inspired South Africa, with Jordan heading the local delegation, to bid to host the 2006 World Cup. We don't know exactly what transpired in the murky underworld of international football realpolitik on the eve of the vote in 2000. Suffice it to say that New Zealand delegate Charles Dempsey, a golf-playing hobbit of a fellow, was given a mandate from his association to vote for South Africa. With talk of notes under hotel room doors and midnight shenanigans, Dempsey disregarded the mandate from Oceania, the bloc he represented, and abstained. His abstention meant that votes between Germany and South Africa to host the 2006 tournament were tied. Sepp Blatter, another of the amiable man school, stepped in and cast his vote for Germany. Jordan and his fellow bid team, Michael Katz, Koos Becker, and Ivan Khoza, dusted themselves off. The country forgot about public enemy number one, Dempsey, and the bid team started racking up the frequent flyer miles in pursuit of hosting the World Cup once again. A couple of years later, with South Africa's 2010 bid in full swing, I remember deciding, pretty much on a whim, to wait for Jordan at Grenada Airport in the Caribbean as he campaigned for South Africa to host the 2010 World Cup. He was jetting in from Trinidad, where he'd spent a couple of what I imagine were trying days with Jack Warner, the dodgy Caribbean power broker and wheeler dealer who sat on the FIFA executive. Jordan knew I was in Grenada for my newspaper, The Sunday Times. He didn't know, however, that I'd be at the airport to say hello. As he fetched his bags and sauntered through passport control, I saw him in his customary dark, slightly shabby suit. He looked green. Whether it was from fatigue or fear of flying, or was simply the delayed after effects of spending too much time with a cash-crazed Warner, I never got to find out. At the airport, he amiably gave me the slip, but we did agree to meet at the palatial golf resort at which he was staying later. At the appointed time, under gently swaying palms, Jordan breezed past in a golf cart, shouting directions to his next stop. I was beginning to feel that I was being dragged into a Steve Martin movie. I was in for one long afternoon. Best keep amiable. I followed on foot, while he hopped from hole to hole in a golf cart. I chased him to the 7th, clutching my notebook, followed him to the 8th. He whizzed across the little bridge to the 10th. I don't want to give the impression he was playing. He wasn't, but there were clearly important things to discuss with the people he was having fun in the golf cart with. Eventually, possibly because he was feeling sorry for me, we agreed to meet for tea. The reason that Jordan and I were in Grenada in the first place was because CONCACAF, the Confederation of North, Central American and Caribbean Football Associations, were having their annual meeting there. Voting for who would host the 2010 World Cup was only a month away, and Jordan wanted to do some last-minute schmoozing. Getting Madiba to press flesh and go walkabout with Warner in Trinidad was part of the initiative, but now Jordan needed to tell the CONCACAF delegates why they should encourage Warner and his big mate, Chuck Blazer, to vote for South Africa. Forgive me while I interrupt a sports story to tell you about the Luke Alfred Show Patreon. As you may know, being a writer is not the most lucrative career choice. Please consider making a small donation to keep the show going at patreon.com/The Luke Alfred Show. But for now, let's get back to the story. It might have seemed like a straightforward matter. When Germany pipped South Africa at the post to host the 2006 World Cup, Sepp Blatter told the world that the next World Cup would be hosted in Africa. Morocco and Egypt had emerged as compelling bids, and Jordan was taking no chances in Grenada. We wondered about Morocco. Their organizing committee said that they would build stadiums and facilities if they won the bid. Surely this was the wrong way round. Didn't they need to show Blatter and his cronies the facilities first, and upon that basis win the bid? Either way, here we were, Jordan, myself, and Blazer and his wife, sipping tea and making World Cup small talk, which, if memory serves, was pretty tiny. Whether they are scumbags or not, all journalists suffer from reputation bias, particularly in the eyes of those who have much to hide. I didn't know it then, but Chuck had been supping at the football trough for years. He had much to hide. Chuck, a bearded man, well over 200 kilograms in weight, stayed off the profiteroles. We asked for milk with excruciating politeness. Soon enough, though, Danny swung aboard a passing cart and chugged off down the hill to discuss matters of grave importance with sundry CONCACAF officials. Jordan was increasingly difficult to get hold of once South Africa had been awarded hosting status in Zurich in 2004. He was always somewhere else. He used 2 passports, both of which were dangerously full. He was always flying. If he wasn't going there, he was coming back. Because it was crazily difficult to pin him down, we resorted to tricking him. One of us on the Sunday Times sports desk would phone him or his secretary. If I remember correctly, he had the figures 2010 as part of his number, and ask him about something besides World Cup preparations. We would ask, for example, about the Champions League, or technological innovations in football, or the race for the English Premiership title. When faced by such questions, Jordan would often be overpowered by his natural enthusiasm for the game. He would be frank, thoughtful, engaging. Talking football in general put him into a good mood, whereupon we pounced, folding a World Cup question or two craftily into our list of questions. Around about that time, I became the Sunday Times' 2010 correspondent. It was less an honor than one of those jobs nobody else wanted to do because they already had their plates full with other stuff. I would meet Jordan for breakfast in Sandton occasionally. I remember agreeing to meet in Eastgate, a mall on the eastern side of Johannesburg. Miraculously, Jordan, who drove a massive BMW, managed to get lost. He seemed so stressed and so absent-minded that I wondered sometimes how he managed to wake up in the morning, or if he perhaps needed to get somebody else to do that for him. Despite escapades on golf carts in the Caribbean and late-night phone calls, we became fond of each other. He was a left-arm medium-pace bowler, he once told me, which somehow fitted. He asked me to write his book, either to be a ghost-written autobiography or a biography. He sometimes looked green again from overwork, which went well with a permanently disheveled look. There was a period, let's not forget, during which FIFA became very uppity about South Africa's perceived lack of building progress, and parachuted a whole lot of their Swiss A team down to South Africa. I remember a name, Delia Fisher. If you needed anything, you went to Delia. She was so time-sensitive, she ticked all the chronological boxes. The World Cup was a jewel, from Siphiwe Tshabalala's equalizer against Mexico in the opening game to Diego Maradona press conferences, from Spain's tiki-taka to Ghana's better-than-expected run and that handball. Eventually, though, the vuvuzelas stopped blaring and the fun ended. The dream began to fade. Worse still, the dream began to sour. It transpired that pre-World Cup Bafana friendlies against Thailand, Colombia, Guatemala and Bulgaria had been fixed by a group of mainly Singaporean match fixers with assumed names like Simon Mega Diamond and Jason Joe Lourdes. They infiltrated the SA Football Association's referees department, very few of whom thought there was anything amiss when the fixers, men they had never set eyes on, offered to procure referees which they hadn't vetted, and at less than the going rate. The South African Football Association, of which Jordan again became president after his World Cup golf cart and mayoral duties were over, became Byzantine and inefficient. Their executive was massive. Chief executives came and went. Here was a culture that appeared to be more enthralled to factionalism and patronage than it did to delivery. In 2011, Blazer and Warner, the compañeros Jordan had been schmoozing in Grenada, stopped scratching each other's backs. Warner was exposed by Blazer in a money for votes scam and resigned off the FIFA executive, but not before he had secured his pension. In one of his more ingenious scams, he built a football center of excellence on the outskirts of Port of Spain in Trinidad. He renamed the facility the João Havelange Center of Excellence without CONCACAF's knowledge, Havelange being the Brazilian bruiser and head of FIFA who was once accused in the Brazilian media of running guns into Bolivia. Using a front company owned by himself, his wife and his son called Renraw, which is Warner spelt backwards, Renraw bought the land for the João Havelange Center of Excellence from Lever Brothers, West Indies. This land they rented back to CONCACAF, who thought they owned both the center and the land upon which it was built. Sir Anthony Cathcart Simmons, former Attorney General of Barbados, wrote an integrity report about Warner and Blazer's goings-on, published in April 2013. In it, he said, quote, "In the end, as a result of his fraudulent conduct, Warner divested CONCACAF and FIFA of approximately $26 million, and Warner obtained the title of the COE property, in other words, the Center of Excellence property, which rightfully belongs to CONCACAF. Warner didn't get to where he got to by retiring to the front lawn to do Tai Chi and frolic with his grandchildren. After Blazer had shopped him, he returned the favor, and so the Federal Bureau of Investigation, or FBI, came after Blazer. The man who had once rented an apartment in Trump Towers on Manhattan only for his cats was pulled off his motorized scooter and told to put his diary on hold. Blazer was nabbed on tax evasion and money laundering charges. It was found out that he loved to pay himself hefty commissions. His world, and that of Warner's, I remember writing at the time, was not one of checks and balances, but one of checks and balances. Jordan wasn't distantly aware that all of this was going on somewhere in the middle distance. He was surely strongly aware of the shenanigans in the so-called Africa Diaspora Program. The details need not concern us here. Suffice it to say that Warner was again involved. In 2015, for example, the Financial Times of London followed the African Diaspora Program money. They concluded that at roughly the same time that FIFA was paying Warner for the Diaspora Legacy Program, so $72 million found its way into Tunisian businessman and international football power broker's HSBC account in Switzerland. It is an amount, they said, that roughly corresponds to the $70 million the South Africans have admitted to, quote, assisting African football federations. This, let's not beat around the bush, is tantamount to admitting you are paying bribes in return for votes. This was not going on while Jordan was peering into his briefcase, trying to remember what it was that he thought he was looking for. The feeling that more could have been made out of the World Cup is widespread. There was so much energy, so much goodwill generated by South Africa's successful hosting in 2010 that the years since seem like an opportunity missed. Jordan surely is part of this missed opportunity. With the goals at his mercy, he, as in rugby, has hoofed it over the bar. He told me and many others in the mid-1990s that football in this country wanted its place in the sun. Given the legacy of apartheid, who would disagree? But what have we done with that place? Do the fields blush with flowers? Are we producing a very small percentage of the world's best players, the world's best administrators, the world's best referees? We all know the answers to these questions. Just this week, Bafana Bafana beat South Sudan in an Africa Cup of Nations qualifier. In some quarters, this was hailed as a victory worth celebrating. The SAFA saga seems like a long-running pantomime. There's always some kerfuffle about money, where it is not, and where it has gone. SAFA's auditors, PricewaterhouseCoopers, obviously fearing reputational damage, didn't only resign once, they resigned twice, in 2019 and 2020. We have all read about the President's discretionary fund. It's not a phrase anyone but the President likes the look of. And how about the Jennifer Ferguson rape allegations against Jordan? Why would a singer and composer like Ferguson, now living in faraway Sweden with children of her own, concoct rape allegations if she didn't feel compelled to do so? What would there possibly be to gain? The slightly jaundiced amongst us can't have helped noticing that the current charges against Jordan of theft and fraud amounting to 1.3 million rand are negligible ones. This suggests that there are those who want Jordan to go and, after this conclusion was reached, they needed to find charges against him to support their desire to be rid of him. Jordan, however, has nothing else. The cut and thrust is what he lives for. And here's a cheeky thought. Given the company he keeps, or more accurately, the company he once kept amongst the power brokers of the international game, the comedy duo that was Warner and Blazer, is it really surprising that he's charged private security to SAFA's account? These are glimpses into a hidden world of dysfunction of which Jordan is only a small part. One can't help but notice in Jordan's case that he has a nasty habit of sticking around, hogging the ball like an old-fashioned playmaker. Whenever someone on the sidelines has shouted for him to come off, he's gestured back that he can't hear and has stayed on. In fact, he's been staying on for close to 30 years now. He's in illustrious company, don't forget. Havelange, Warner's chum, was president of FIFA from 1974 until 1998, 24 years. Sepp Blatter, Havelange's successor, was president of FIFA for 17 years. It tells you that men of their ilk, through amiability, patronage, the breezy arts of backslapping and the dark arts of secret handshakes, tend to like the positions they're in. That means they stick around. When they need to go to ground, they do. A couple of months later, they're up and running again, which enables them to stick around until at least the next drama. These are the guys that play for the full 90. They always have. If you enjoyed this episode of The Luke Alfred Show, please give me a 5-star rating. As an independent creator, this podcast is made possible through your support.